on this computer. All right, there you go. So it's recording. And then we go live on Facebook. That takes a minute or two. So if you're listening to the recording right now, you're going to need to fast forward for about a minute. So just so you know. There we go. It's coming. Okay, now it's Jimmy. I'm going to close that. All right, very well. All right, we want to welcome everyone to week number, I don't know what this is, of our study in the book of Revelation. We're in Revelation chapter 6, which is the discussion of the seven seals. We started the discussion several weeks ago, but we've had a break for a couple of weeks. So I'm going to do some review. I'm assuming that's going to be okay with everyone. Let's go ahead and open with a word of prayer before we get started, and then we'll kind of get ourselves into things. So, Father, we come to you tonight and we ask for your grace, that we ask that you would give us humility before the word, humility before Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God, the Lion from the tribe of Judah who sits on the throne, the one who has opened the scroll and was worthy because you were slain and you purchased for God with your blood us, people from every tribe and nation and people and tongue. And we thank you for that. And we thank you, in fact, that we have people from different parts of the states, different parts of the country, 3 or 4 different time zones, plus people from India and elsewhere. We thank you that we have this opportunity to use this medium to teach and to learn and to grow and to fellowship and to commune. Thank you for all that you've given to us now. We pray especially that you'll help us indeed as we enter into the Christmas season and to remember what you have done and who you are, and to make that part of our life testimony of living out the gospel of Jesus Christ. So give us wisdom now and discernment as we deal with this text. We pray your blessings upon us now. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. All right. So we discussed last time, and again, stop me anytime for those of you guys on the Zoom. And if you're on Facebook Live, I want to welcome you. If you're watching this on YouTube, thanks for checking in. This is always, you're welcome to join us live in the Zoom study. We do it at 6 p.m. Pacific time on Wednesday nights. And all you have to do is send me an email, a message on Facebook Messenger or whatever, with your email address. So I need your email address to send you the Zoom link. So, and I want to thank you for being a part. So we discussed already the beginning of chapter 6, and let me remind ourselves of a few things. So the story begins in chapter 4 with God sitting on a throne. That's the second story. The first one was on an island in Patmos, and he writes to the 7 churches, the 7 messages. And that's chapters 1, 2, and 3. Chapter 4 begins with John going up into heaven. Sees God sitting on a throne. He's a sovereign one. Chapter 5, God's got something in his right hand. What is it?
Scroll.
A scroll. He's got a scroll. He's got a book in his right hand. I believe, and I think a lot of commentators, I haven't surveyed how many of them would affirm this. I think most of them would affirm that this scroll is God's will, and God's will in particular on how the nations and all of creation is going to be redeemed. So there's 2 ways of looking at this. As I said before, it's been a little while. One way is to say that what has to happen so that the throne of God, which is in heaven in chapters 4 and 5, comes down to the new creation in Revelation 21. Something has to happen, and the answer is on the scroll. The scroll is going to, this is what's going to happen and how it's going to happen so that God's throne can come down from heaven to the new creation. Another way of looking at it is, how do the nations get redeemed? And because we see throughout the book, we haven't gotten there yet, that the nations are opposed to God's work and God's people and everything. Yet we get to 21, and it says the nations walk by the light of the New Jerusalem, and the kings bring their glory into it. You're like, oh, how'd that happen? And the answer's on the scroll. The scroll is God's will. We know the scroll is important because John begins, an angel says, hey, who's worthy to open the scroll? And John's like, oh, no, I can't find anybody. And he starts to weep. So John's weeping over the scroll tells us that it can't be opened, tells us it's important, whatever's on it. Another reason why we know it's important is that it's in God's right hand. And then another reason why we know it's important is that an elder says to John, hey, don't worry about it. The lion has overcome. So it's to open the scroll and to break its seals. And John turns and he doesn't see a lion. Anybody remember, what does he see? Yeah,
a lamb.
He sees a lamb. And it was a lamb that was slain. Or technically, by the way, if you translate this accurately from the text. It says, I saw a lamb as if it had been slain. Now we know it looked like it had been slain because it had been slain. It's Jesus, and he actually did die. But he sees it as if it had been slain because it's standing, which means it's resurrected. And that'll be important when we get to the beast later on, because the beast is going to be as if one of its heads was as if it had been slain. Exact same language. All right, Jesus then takes the scroll, begins to break the 7 seals. And he's broken the first 6. Actually, no, he hasn't broken the first 6 seals. We're actually just starting this now. So he breaks the first seal, which we discussed a little bit last time. And we read chapter 6 last time, so I won't read it all this time again, but as we go through it, we'll read a couple verses at a time here. But chapter 6 has 4 seals that are clearly distinguished from the last 3 seals. The first 4 seals, John hears one of the 4 living creatures say, "Come." John sees a rider on a white horse, a rider on a horse. So the first 4 seals are clearly distinguished from the last 3, and that's going to be important later on when we get to the 7 trumpets also, just to kind of notice how John's writing this as literature and the way he's telling a story. So let's go ahead now. Let's read verses 1 and 2, and then we'll review the first seal again and kind of move on to our second seal. Revelation chapter 6, somebody want to read verses 1 and 2?
I can. Okay.
Okay, the 7 seals. Then I saw the Lamb open one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures call out as with a voice of thunder, "Come!" I looked, and there was a white horse. Its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer.
Okay. So, and I'm looking at the notes that I gave you guys now here. And a rider on a white horse, he has a bow, a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. And this is a little bit review. So if I go too quickly, or you want me to repeat something, or you weren't here and you want me to repeat something, that's fine also. The rider represents war and conquest. The bow, this is on the notes, the bow is a symbol of military conquest. And in my opinion, the bow is one of the key things that distinguishes that this is not Jesus. All right, so point number 2 is who or what is this rider? And there are 3 views. The first view is the one that I hold to, and I think it's probably the most popular view amongst the scholarly community, that this rider represents false Christ and false prophets or false teachers. And the fact that he has a bow, Jesus doesn't have a bow, he has a sword. And you might think, well, gosh, a sword's worse. But Jesus' sword comes from his mouth. Jesus doesn't wage war with the sword in a literal sense, like he's hacking people with it. His sword is his word. And the realization actually that a bow is a very significant symbol of warfare. This guy wages war differently than Jesus wages war. This cannot be Jesus. That's the way I look at it. Now, the second and third views are that this is actually Jesus. And the basis of that is that in chapter 6 and in chapter 19, you see a rider on a white horse. And in 19, it's definitely Jesus. I mean, there's just no question about it. So you go, oh, see, rider on a white horse in chapter 6, rider on a white horse in chapter 19, it's Jesus. So these other 2 views say, one says it's Jesus at his first coming. So that idea that he breaks the seals and we're going to go back in history. This is Jesus coming at his first coming, and everything else happens after the first coming of Jesus. And that view makes some sense. I just don't think it's correct. The third view is that this is Jesus at his second coming, and this is often the view of the end time literalists, kind of what's called dispensationalism. I won't get into that now unless you want me to. But the rapture theology, the Hal Lindsey theology, the Tim LaHaye theology, for those of you guys from America that know who those guys are, end time sensationalism. And the idea is that nothing in the book of Revelation happens until the last 7 years to the last 3.5 years of human history. So whenever this writer comes, which is Jesus, and he comes and he raptures the church out of the way, then everything else starts. And I argued long ago, no, Revelation's describing you what happened from the coming of Jesus, right? Remember, Jesus is worthy to open the scroll because he was slain. There's no reason for him to, you know what? I know I'm worthy to open it, but I'm going to sit around here for like, maybe 1900 and some odd years before I decide to open it. It's like, no, he's already breaking the seals and he's already opening up the scroll. So I certainly do not ascribe to that particular viewpoint. I think it has a lot of problems with it. And we discussed a lot of that last week. So Okay, any questions on that at all? No? All right, did I go over everything too quickly here? There's some notes at the top that I skipped. Are we okay? All right, let's look at the rider on the second horse. So Revelation 6, verses 3 and 4. If somebody wants to read that.
I can.
Thank you.
When he opened the second seal, and this is ESV. So,
Okay.
when he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come," and out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword.
Okay. Now let's go through the notes here. It was given him to take peace from the earth, and that people might slay one another. And I put at the top of letter B, right on the second horse, represents war and bloodshed. Now, if you were with us last time that we met, which was several weeks ago, I mentioned that the four seals, the first four, strongly parallel Mark chapter 13 and Matthew 24. And if you don't remember that, but what's happening in those two chapters, Mark 13 and Matthew 24, it's in Luke 17, but it's also in Luke 21 also, is Jesus is describing what's going to happen between the time of ultimately his death and the destruction of Jerusalem, which happened 40 years later. And the parallels are tremendous. And what we see in the parallels is, hey guys, life's going to go on as normal. And this isn't describing something like, oh my goodness, unbelievable war. All of a sudden there's war everywhere. There's always been war everywhere, right? I mean, this is nothing new. It's like, oh, thanks for telling us that there's war and bloodshed. Like, oh, surprise, surprise. Like, no, there's no surprise. We know this is happening. This is the normal course of events. Now, let me clarify in case somebody's watching on YouTube or on Facebook and goes, wait, I am not suggesting that the four seals happened between 30 and 70 AD. That's not the view that I hold to. So and that view is called preterism. If you're interested, we can discuss more. I am not a preterist. I do not ascribe to that viewpoint at all. But the parallels between Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and this passage here in Revelation 6 are there, which tell us that what's happening here is life's going to go on as normal, and these things are going to happen. Now, second thing it says, this writer also was given a great sword. This is point number 2. Now, I don't have this on the notes, but the word for sword here is not the same word for sword that's coming out of Jesus's mouth. All right. And I've spent a lot of time on this because in the book of Revelation, he uses words to link passages or link things together. But the problem that there's two words for sword. One's just like a large sword and one's like a small little dagger. And it's not a big deal, but I'll just leave it at this. The word here is not the same. Those words are kind of used interchangeably. So you can't make an argument because it's a different word for sword. It's not the same one that comes out of Jesus' mouth because the two words are kind of used interchangeably. However, one of the two key words is every time he refers to Jesus' sword, he always uses this one particular word, and it's not the word that's used here. So I think there is a little bit of a distinction there. Now, here's the next thing, and that's what's really important about this writer. Number 3, the word slain. Do all your translations say slain here? It was given him to slay. How's that? He went out, it was granted him to take peace from the earth, and that men might slay one another. Do all your translations say that? Anybody have something different at the end of verse 4?
Mine says,
go ahead.
mine says slaughter.
Slaughter. Okay. That's the King James, or is that the Catholic?
New American Bible.
New American Bible. Yep. Very good. That's fine. All right. And Anthony, what do you have?
NRSV, it says slaughter as well.
It says slaughter. Okay. I'm just looking at
New American says kill.
which one?
New American Standard.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the newest New American Standard.
Oh, I don't have that. Yeah. I work out of the New American Standard almost all the time. I'm like, mine doesn't say that. Is that like the one from 21 or 20 or something like that? It just came out, right?
2020.
2020. Okay. It just came out. I'm like, oh, I didn't even know that. So
I have
like,
kill. I
what's
have
that?
NIV and it also says kill.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Well, we don't worry about the NIV. I'm just kidding. I just looked it up now. Let me see. That men might. Okay, so the NIV of 1984 says slay. How's that? That's the only one I have available. So that's the old one. I think that's the original NIV. All right. The point of that is the word here is slay. It's a different word. I'm not sure why they went with kill, but slay, slaughter is okay. This word is always used in reference to Christ or the people of God as the ones who are slain. Always, no exceptions, except one. All right, so, and I put the references on your handout. 5:6, 5:9, 5:12, 6:4, 6:9, 13:3, 13:8, and 18:24. Every time except once, it's used of Jesus being slain. I saw a lamb as if it had been slain, or the people of God who are slain. The only exception is chapter 13, verse 3. But that's describing the beast, because one of his heads was as if it had been slain. And I'll discuss this more when we get to chapter 13. And tell me if I'm going too quickly here, if you want to discuss this now. But what's happening in the description of the beast is that the beast is imitating Jesus. The reason why the same words used in chapter 13 is because the beast is imitating Christ and wants you to think it's Jesus. One of his heads was as if it had been slain. You're like, oh, wait, is that Jesus? No, it's not Jesus. So that's the only exception. And it's not a real exception because it's evil imitating the good. The point then is every other use of the word slain is it's of Christians who are being killed. So I would simply say it this way. This writer is war. And if you want to say, well, he's slaying people, and that includes like lots of people, that's fine. But it definitely includes Christians too. And that's the point. And I'll make that point further as we get into the third seal here in just a minute. It certainly includes Christians because the word slain is the key word that indicates it might not be only Christians here, but it certainly includes Christians that are those who are suffering and being slain by the rider on the second horse. And that's going to be important as we proceed. And some of you are like, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense because I always thought that the seven seals were like God's wrath on the wicked. And guess what? This is not God's wrath on the wicked. That's right. The seven bowls are. Seven trumpets might be more difficult. Seven seals are not. Right. This is simply God saying this is what happens when humanity's in power. When humanity's in power, guess what? False prophets, false Christ, false teachers who deceive many people. Oh, and guess what else did they do? What they do best, war and bloodshed. And if you read through Genesis, remember, war, it doesn't take long for there to be war and bloodshed. Obviously, there's war in the garden or just after the garden with Cain and Abel. And then later on, there's war. Lamech kills two people and boasts about it. And then there's more violence with Nimrod and things like that. Okay, so that's the rider on the second horse. Any questions or comments or thoughts? All right, very good. Here we go. Third rider. Somebody want to read verses 5 and 6? Or third seal?
I'll read it.
Thanks, Rob.
Just excuse the background. My Shih Tzu is snoring right now. Yes. I got the NIV. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine.
All right, very good. Sorry, but right at the beginning of your reading, we heard a loud snore, and it was hilarious.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if anybody listened to whatever you read, but we're just hoping everyone caught it. If not, if you're listening on Facebook Live or whatever, just go back and rewind it. So, all right, here we go. Rider on a black horse represents economic hardship, and I put down oppression of the poor. And let me explain why I put down oppression of the poor. First off, here's a voice from among the four living creatures saying, "Hey, get a quart of wheat for a denarius." And I put down in the notes, letter A, quart. That's what the Greek says. A quart of wheat, I think Rob says 2 pounds, which is probably what the weight of it is. But the measure of it is a quart. A quart of wheat for a denarius and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. A quart of wheat can feed an individual for a day. That's what the note says. Equals individual. A quart of wheat can feed one individual for a day. Okay. That is serious inflation. That's 12 times the rate of inflation. Because that means only one person's eating today, and there's no money left over for anything else, like taxes for Rome or taxes for the temple if you're in Judea, or anything else that you might want. Nothing left, rent or whatever it might be. That's it. A quart of wheat is enough wheat to feed one person. Is 12 times the rate of inflation. 3 quarts of barley. Now, barley is a cheaper grain, right? So it's like the really poor eat this. Well, and at least they can buy 3 quarts of barley, and that's enough food for a family for a day's wages, right? But still, that's still 8 times the rate of inflation. Because again, there's no food left over, at least the family can eat, but there's no money left over for taxes or for rent or any other needs. This is serious inflation. Now, here's the thing. The wealthy are not as seriously impacted by inflation because they're always going to have money to buy food. Remember, in the Roman Empire, you got really 3% that are wealthy. You got 7% that are probably okay, but they might be impacted by this kind of inflation. You got 90% who can't survive with this kind. I mean, survival is going to be difficult with this kind of inflation. But notice, do not damage the oil and the wine, it says. And oil and the wine were goods for the wealthy. All right, they're luxury goods, and only the wealthy. And so I think just the description of this seal and what happens says this is what's affecting the poor and not the wealthy. All right, so I think there might be a fill in your blank in your notes. And the scales weighing out grain rations affects the poor, and oil and the wine are goods for the wealthy. Now, this is really significant for the Roman world, and the more background we have on the Roman Empire, and you may have heard this before, I've written some blogs on this, so you can go to my website, determinedtruth.com, and find the blogs on the third seal. I think I wrote this during the third seal during when COVID first came out, because everyone's saying, oh, COVID vaccine, the third seal's happening. It's like, what are you talking about? Or the 4 seals are happening. It's like, no, COVID is not the signs of the seven seals, which is funny because they skipped the first 2 seals and they just like went straight to the third. It's like, okay, whatever you're talking about. Or actually, I think they went to the 4th because that makes more sense. But anyways, in the Roman world, Rome had a massive, many of the wealthy persons, so 3% of the empire are wealthy. Many of the wealthy individuals live in Rome, and they have this extravagant lifestyle. And the reality is, for this extravagant lifestyle in Rome itself, they need a lot of slaves in the city of Rome and daily workers to accommodate this lavish lifestyle of the upper class. So Rome had a population problem. And the way the Roman Empire decided to solve the population problem, they had to get people to move to Rome. They said, you know what? If you move to Rome, we'll provide you free grain. Every citizen of the Romans, every person who lives in Rome, not be a citizen, but every person who lives in Rome has access to free grain. Now, here's what that meant. Obviously, you get a lot of people going, especially the lower 30% of that 90 that can't survive on a daily basis as it is. They go, hey, let's go to Rome. All right, they lived in utter squalor. I mean, a putrid condition. It was horrendous circumstances in which these people lived, abject poverty, but they had grain. Right? And they were fighting for labor and serving the wealthy and things of that nature also. Well, here's what happens. Rome says, well, we're going to go buy that grain from Egypt or the grain fields of North Africa. We're going to buy that grain from the grain fields of, Turkey or Greece or wherever. They're going to buy grain, but we're going to pay a fixed price for it. So we're going to buy the grain to supply the people of Rome, but here's how much we're going to pay for it. Well, as things happen, farmers decide, you know what? If I grow grain in my field, I'm only going to get a certain amount of money for it. And I'm going to, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to plant grapes. I'm going to plant olives. I'm going to plant something that the wealthy still want, and the wealthy will pay top dollar for it. I'm going to make more money. Okay, so now here's what you have happening. Rome's paying a fixed price for some grain. That means there's less grain available, and the people who are selling the grain, they need to sell the rest of their grain for higher amount of money because they have to make a profit, and they're not making a profit on what they sell to Rome. Then you have farmers who are saying, you know what, I'm not even going to plant grain, which means there's even less grain available. What does that do to the price of grain? It continues to rise. Now, you get the Roman Empire. So go from Spain to all of Southern Europe, Turkey, a little bit of the Middle Eastern area of Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, Palestine, which is called Palestina. Well, it wasn't called Palestina for another 100 years yet, but nonetheless, or less than 50 years. And then you have North Africa. famine is going to strike one of those areas throughout. It's just not going to be long until it's a famine. And if you read the Bible, in the book of Acts, Paul's taking an offering. In 1 Corinthians, he mentions this offering for the poor in Jerusalem because they have been hit by a famine. Famine is now going to mean there's even less grain available. All this does is it skyrockets the price of grain and makes it even less and less and less affordable. What you see described in the third seal is reality throughout the Roman Empire, because Rome's offering free grain for all of its citizens so they can have the wealthy have this lavish lifestyle, and the poor suffer even more. So they have taxation, they have other debts and obligations, and the continuously rising price of grain, especially because they decided to grow less grain or there's a famine, things like that. Does that make sense there? Right. And so guess what? The majority of Christians in the first century, like the overwhelming majority of Christians, were poor. So guess what? This also affects the Christians. So the first seal was false prophets and false Christs, which Jesus says, watch out, because false prophets and false Christs will try to lead you astray, to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. Then you have the second rider who's slaying people through war and bloodshed, which certainly includes Christians. The third rider then is economic oppression, which impacts the poor, which means it definitely affects the Christians also. Things are not going well here for the church. But the one who overcomes, remember the 7 messages? The one who overcomes, I'll grant the right to sit down with me in my throne. The one who overcomes, I'll grant to eat from the tree of life. The one who overcomes, I'm going to give you a white stone, which was a stone that was an invitation to a banquet. And I'm going to give you a new name written on the stone, which no one knows but the one who receives it. You got a special invitation to my heavenly banquet. And now you can see why this is so important, because this, the 6 seals, at least the first 4, is the reality for the average person in Rome, which certainly included the majority of all Christians. All right, let me stop there. Any questions? Does that make sense if I go too quickly over that?
Yeah.
Helen, if you're there, I'm going to mute you. I'm not sure if you were talking to us or not. Okay, thanks, Helen. Okay. Very good. Okay, here we go. The 4th seal. Let's go to the 4th one then, unless there's any questions. And let's go to verses 7 and 8, if someone wants to read verses 7 and 8.
Reading from NIV.
Thanks.
When the Lamb opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature says, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth.
All right. Now, I think that the rider on the 4th horse is adding nothing new to the story. And maybe you can say, sickness, like that's where people get COVID ideas from, right? Sickliness, things of that nature. But it seems that this seal is summarizing the first 3 seals. And its rider was named Death, and Hades was following behind it. So that the result of the first 3 seals is summarized now here with, this is bad news. This is death, and it's not a good thing. Of course, it does add, and of course, death by wild beasts. All right. So I think that's all that's happening in the 4th seal, is that it's a summarization, maybe adding a few kind of details, but ultimately the result is death, and Hades was following behind it. Now, if what I have said is true, right, if my understanding of the text is correct, things are not going well for the average person in the Roman Empire, certainly the poor and the marginalized, which is 90% of the empire, which certainly also includes the Christians. And that makes perfect sense when we read the 5th seal. All right, but before we do that, any questions or comments?
I'm curious about, it says that they were given power over a fourth of the people of the earth. Why just a fourth?
Yeah. So what you're going to see, what we'll see in the seals, trumpets, and bowls. So there's not a I think you're asking for a specific answer, and I'm not going to give you one because I don't think there is one. But what's happening here is John's writing a literary document, and then the way he's writing the literature, he's going to have the seals, trumpets, and bowls are going to increase in intensity. That's all that's happening. It's just a literary thing of increasing intensity. So it's not like, oh, only 1/4 of the earth is actually affected as if this was a literal number. The seals affect 1/4. The trumpets affect 1/3. We're told about 7 thunders, but we don't. But they're never described. He's like, oh, seal it up. But we suspect that they would be 1/2. Right, 1/4, 1/3, 1/2, and then the bowls are totality. So it's just an increasing intensity as in the way John's describing it. I wouldn't take this as a literal number that's actually describing 1/4 of the earth actually suffered as like some exactitude. It's just simply a literary thing of increasing intensity. That
Yeah,
help?
yeah.
Okay, good. All right, very good. Good question. Okay. So now, if you go back to the top really briefly, or not the top, but like kind of the middle of your notes, the end of page 1, the beginning of page 2 of the handout that I gave you guys, and I put down chapter 6, 1 through 15, the first 6 seals, and then I color coded the notes. Verse 1, I saw when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals. Verse 3, when he opened the 2nd seal. Verse 5, when he opened the 3rd seal. Verse 7, when he opened the 4th seal. Verse 9, when he opened the 5th seal. All right, all sound the same, but note the first 4 seals. I heard one of the 4 living creatures say, come. I heard the 2nd living creature say, come. I heard the 3rd living creature say, come. I heard the 4th living creature say, come. And all of a sudden we get to the 5th seal and it says, I saw. He heard. Boom, I saw. Clearly marking the 5th seal as distinct from the first 4. And just that 4-3 pattern, not huge, but it's important to know that this is the way John's kind of telling this story for reasons that will become important later on. All right, so with that being said, let's read chapter 6, verses 9 through 11. Now, the other thing to notice is we've been reading 2 verses every time, and now we're reading 3 verses. It's getting longer. The first 4 seals were about the same length. I mean, the 4th one's kind of like a little bit longer, but the 5th seal all of a sudden is longer, and the 6th seal is going to be way longer. So that's another literary feature that tells you, hey, the 5th and 6th seals stand out from the first 4. So does that make sense? Does someone want to read the 5th seal, verses 9 through 11?
I'll read
Yes,
it.
Pastor.
Okay, thank you. Jackie.
When he broke open the 5th seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been slaughtered because of the witness they bore to the word of God. They cried out in a loud voice, how long will it be, holy and true master, before you sit in judgment and avenge our blood on the inhabitants of the earth? Also 11.
Yes, please.
Each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to be patient a little while longer until the number was filled of their fellow servants and brothers who were going to be killed as they had been.
All right, so there's a use of the word slain or slaughtered, and it's good to see, Jackie, that your translation's being consistent with the translation, however, whether it's slaughtered or slain, whatever, which definitely is applied to the people of God, right? Because they have been slaughtered or slain because of, verse 9, because of the word of God and because of the testimony which they maintain. All right, so again, here we go. I saw, he broke the 5th seal and I saw. Now, let's stop for a second. Those who suggest that the 7 seals are God's judgment or wrath of God upon the nations have a problem here, because nothing happens in the 5th seal. The first 4 seals were like war and bloodshed and violence and false Christ and wild beasts and famine. Nothing happens in the 5th seal on the earth. This is totally like, oh, I saw these souls under the throne of God. And they're like, hey, Lord, how long is this going to go on? And the fact that they're going, how long is this going to go on? And the fact that they're the righteous people or God's people or the people of God tells you they've been suffering under the first 4 seals. It's not the wrath of God upon the nations. The first 4 seals are, this is what happens when the nations are in power. This is what happens when humanity rules. We start wars, and there's bloodshed as a result of that, and there's false teaching as a result of that. And oh, guess what? Famine as a result of that. And the poor are often the ones who are suffer the most, and the poor and the marginalized. Not the only ones who suffer, but they suffer the most. And so the 5th seal, all of a sudden, is God's people are going like, how long is this going to go on, oh Lord? Right? And how long, oh Lord, is a famous cry of the Old Testament scriptures, and I gave you, I think, in the notes under number E1, 4 references: Psalm 13, 1 and 2, Psalm 74, 9 and 10, 94 verse 3, and 119 verse 84. How long, O Lord, is the cry for God's people? Because God's people are, generally speaking, disadvantaged when it comes to the people of the world. How long? Now, I put down in the notes, this is not like until you avenge our blood, or that's how, my translation is. Until you avenge our blood. And I said, this is not a vindictive plea. It's a cry for justice. Okay. Vengeance is when you take it into your own hands. They're not crying, hey, Lord, I want vengeance and I'm going to get it now. And they go about paying people back. They're saying, Lord, when are you going to bring justice? But there's a problem. And that problem is this: if God brought justice today, that would include the judgment of all the nations. But the nations haven't been redeemed yet. And now I'm using the word nations loosely because we don't know when the nations are actually redeemed. I mean, obviously, those of us in this room here represent a lot of the different nations and nationalities. Okay. And so some of the nations have been redeemed. When is it then all of those who are going to be redeemed have been redeemed? We don't know that answer. But at this point in time, hardly anybody from the nations has been redeemed yet. And so they're told, you know what? Great question. How long until you avenge our blood? They're crying out for justice because Rome's abuse of power, the nation's abuse of power, the nation's causing war, the nation's bringing about famine, the rulers of the earth doing these things. And as a result of that, the poor and the and oppressed are suffering. And they're like, how long, O Lord? And God's like, in a little while longer. And look what it says. It was given to them, verse 11, a white robe. And white robes are very important. We'll get to that. And as we see later on, I keep saying things are really important, but as we get there, like later on in the text, you're going to go, oh yeah, I'll just remind you because you're not going to remember them all. A white robe, and they were told that they should rest for a little while longer until the number of their fellow servants, and by the way, the Greek doesn't say a little while longer, it says like a little time. I don't think I put that on your notes there, but I didn't put that in your notes. For like a little time. Until, and look what it says, until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers and sisters who were to be killed, even as they had been, would be completed also. And you're like, that sounds kind of like morbid here a little bit. Sorry for our friends in India, like what does morbid mean? That sounds a little bit like bleak and deathly. And what? God's not going to bring justice until more Christians are killed? But more Christians being killed is the solution. We don't know that yet until we read ahead. What's on the scroll is the fact that the nations are redeemed when the Christians are killed. By means of the Christians dying. How's that way? By means of the Christians faithfully dying, just like Jesus did. Another way of saying it, by means of the people of God, I think I just said by means of the nations dying, by means of the people of God dying, just like Jesus did. Another way of saying it would be by means of the people of God loving their neighbor as themselves, just like Jesus did. That's how the nations are redeemed. And we know that's the whole point, right? I mean, when are the nations going to be redeemed? Because until then, the New Jerusalem doesn't come down from heaven. And so the martyrs, a martyr is someone who dies willingly for a cause. The martyrs under the throne of God are like, how long, O Lord? And God's like, sorry, not yet. More of you have to die. Well, what do you mean more of us have to die? Well, that's how the game works. They're like, you guys die. These guys are like, oh my goodness, that's where righteousness is found. Because peace is found not in war, it's found in love. Peace is found not in violence, but in suffering violence for the sake of the other, right? And there's this, so you go back to the Gospels, the major contrast between the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of the world. And I've probably trumped that point too many times. Okay, so now, does that make sense? So the fifth seal is nothing happens on the earth. It's not God's wrath. It totally debunks the whole idea that the seven seals are God's wrath upon the wicked. that the seven seals are going to happen in the last 7 years of human history, the last 3.5 years. That can't be true because nothing happens on the earth. It's simply God's people going, hey, Lord, how long? And why would they be crying out, how long? Because they've been suffering too. And so again, this is not God's wrath. It's, how about this? I'll give you one other way of thinking about this. In Romans chapter 1, it says that the nations knew God, but they did not honor him as God. What does it say? But they did not honor him as God or give whatever, give him praise. So God gave them over. That's what's happening here. God is in charge, but he's like, you know what? Have it. You want it your way? It's not God like bringing about these things. He's like, you guys go ahead. Sure, whatever. You rule the way you want to rule. I'll bring about my kingdom this way through these people. You rule the way you want to rule. And when they rule the way they want to rule, this is what happens. It's destruction. Okay. Any questions or comments? All right. You go, psh, right? Bursting your minds in terms of what, that's not the way I've been taught. Exactly. Unfortunately, there's nothing radical here, by the way, in what I'm saying in terms of the scholarly world. It's just totally in terms of the popular marketplace, unfortunately. All right, let's go to the sixth seal. Because, and I'll kind of give you a clue. The sixth seal is the answer to the prayers of the saints. It's the final judgment. But we know from reading on the rest of the book, this doesn't happen for a while. I know this actually is describing something that's in the future. So, all right, because this is like, how long, O Lord, until you avenge our blood? So the fifth seal is the people of God crying out. The sixth seal are the nations crying out because God brings justice. So verses 12 through 17, if somebody wants to read those verses.
I read it myself.
Mm-hmm.
I watched yes, he opened the sixth seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth. As slate picks dropped from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The sky rested like a squirrel rolling up, and every mountain and Iceland was removed from its place. Then the kings of earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and every slave and every free man hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand?
All right. So this is a leap into the future describing the final judgment, which we know doesn't happen until chapter 20. All right. And it happens like several times in the book. So, so this is the final judgment. So as far as like time is concerned, the first four seals describe history from the coming of Christ until the second coming of Christ, which it describes history from the garden of after Adam and Eve kicked out of the garden until the second coming of Christ. The fifth seal is just describing, hey, God's people going, hey, how long is this going to happen? And the sixth seal is a leap to the future, describing the final judgment, because what you have is the first four seals are obviously together. The fifth and the sixth seal is, the fifth seal is God's people crying out. The sixth seal is the nations crying out. God's people cry out to God for justice. The nations cry out to the rocks and the mountains. Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne, for the great day of the wrath has come, and who can stand? So that's judgment day. That's the final judgment. So that's kind of the big picture. So I put down on the notes, letter F, sixth seal is the judgment upon the world. And it's the context is persecution for the people of God, based on Isaiah and Habakkuk and all that good stuff. It's final judgment. I think so. This is at the end of that first end of letter F. Final judgment, question mark. I think so, because it says it's the great day of the wrath. So there you go. Now note, and you're supposed to count upon the kings of the earth, the great men, the commanders, the rich, the strong, free, slave and free. 7. he describes 7 groups of people. It's all humanity. And you could say it's not including God's people, but all humanity, all the nations. And we're going to see this list, or a very similar list, a couple other times as we move on. Now they cry to the mountains. I'm going to go back to the sky rolling up like a scroll in just a second. They cry to the mountains. Now here's where you have to stop and go, okay, well, first off, if they're actually crying to mountains themselves, then they're like idiots, because mountains aren't going to hear you. What do mountains often symbolize in the scriptures? And there's several things that they can symbolize. Anybody know?
Temples were built in the mountains.
So okay, so Sandy, go ahead.
Temples and
Yes,
that they were on the mountains.
that's right. Temples were on the mountains. Very good. Yep. Andrew, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I just say that they symbolize God's dwelling.
Okay. Yeah, Eden was a mountain, so Eden could be where God dwells, because God dwells on the top of the mountain. All right, very good. Put those two together, and there's something else also. If anyone has faith to say to this mountain, be thrown in the sea, and it will be done. Why would Jesus say, if you have faith, you can cast a mountain into the sea? Which, by the way, people have tried that. It hasn't worked yet so far, but it's because that's not what I meant. But what does mountain symbolize in Mark 12, or Mark 11, when Jesus says, have faith, you can cast a mountain into the sea? It's the same thing here. All right, let's go back to Sandy's answer. The top of a mountain is the temple. The temple is always going to be at the highest point in the capital city. In other words, a mountain is where the capital city is, and they always have a wall around it. And then there's the palace, and then above that is the temple. So the point of that is mountains symbolize nations or kingdoms or kings. And we'll see this in chapter 17, that you're going to see this harlot, and she's riding the beast, which has 7 heads, and the 7 heads are 7 mountains. And they are 7 kings. It's like, well, it's both. So that's Revelation chapter 17. It says there are 7 mountains and 7 kings. So kings or kingdoms is what mountains symbolize. So they're crying out to hey, the kings of the earth, help us, save us from the wrath by the way, from the wrath of the Lamb. All right. And so you have this, I put down the F2A, a contrast between the cries of the 5th seal and the 6th seal, the cries of the God's people for justice and the cries of everyone else for salvation from judgment day. And save us from the wrath of the Lamb. I put down irony because although Karen sent me a note about a wild lamb that was fearsome, but for the most part, lambs are not fearsome creatures, and they are not to be feared. So, okay, does that make sense so far? We've gone through the first 6 seals. We'll finish up a few more thoughts here. Oh, and I noticed, by the way, I put down in your notes part of one of my chapters. I think this is probably one of my chapters from my commentary on grain in the Roman Empire. So if you already read that, that's down in the below. I didn't even notice I had that until just now. So sorry if I just repeated all that and you already read it. Okay.
I have a question.
Please.
In verse 17, it says, for the great day of their wrath has come.
Yep.
Which they? The heavenly council?
No, from the one who sits on the throne in verse 16 and the Lamb. Okay. So it's God and Jesus. Make sense? Yep. The one who sits on the throne and the Lamb. The great day of their wrath has come. Yep. But good thinking. That's very good thinking. Very good idea. Okay. Somebody else? All right, here we go. So I put down the notes then, when will the 6th seal come? And I said, how long, O Lord? The question remains just as much a part of the life of the people of God today as it did then, right? I mean, we're like, hey, Lord, how long? All right. And some more than others. The answer, which you already seen evidence of, is that it will not happen immediately. The people of God must be prepared to endure suffering at the hands of the world. One of the best biblical scholars in the book of Revelation says, David De Silva says, there's only one remedy, one path to relief and safety, to remain a faithful witness to God and to the Lamb, and to keep oneself untangled from the sins of the Roman imperial system, no matter what temporary disadvantages or deprivations that entails. All right, so imagine this. You're already struggling to get grain, and Rome says, hey, All you have to do to get grain is come to one of our pagan temples and worship Caesar. All you have to do to get grain is come to one of our pagan festivals in honor of this deity for your trade, so that you can go ahead and participate in this trade guild. And you're desperate for food. And then a false teacher like Jezebel, this is Revelation 2, comes into the church and says, oh, you know what? We know, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 8, as they said to Paul in 1 Corinthians 8, there's no other God but one, so those gods don't exist. And so now you're being threatened with feeding your family, feeding yourself, teachers who are telling you, yeah, you can do those things and compromise. And John coming along saying, no, you have it right. You do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroy. Right? You can't serve God and mammon, as Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6. Okay, so that's what's happening here. Now, since we have a few minutes left, unless somebody has a question or comment.
Yeah, I wonder if you could unpack something, because I'm
Please.
struggling with this immensely, and I have been for quite some time.
With what?
I've been struggling with something
Okay.
recently, to be honest with you, for quite some time, but I don't want to get all legalistic, but in your blog from yesterday, you talked about how oppressive it was in Roman time because you had to buy into the empire, and yet by today's standards, it's just as bad, but it's more disguised because it's so subtle. But don't we all have to function within the society, and we all have to buy into the social component of it, or even the geopolitical component of it to survive?
Yes.
And I don't like it at all.
Right.
But
yes.
I have children to feed. I have a mortgage to cover.
Yeah.
There's tension there. There's tension like crazy.
That's right. There is tension there, and I don't know that anyone has the answer. I've been grappling with this for 30 years, especially once I started my studies of Revelation 25 years ago, when I first started getting into the book of Revelation. I'm like, wait a minute, Revelation 13. You're like, what do I do with this? I don't think there's an answer. The first answer, however, is to be aware of it. So just having an awareness, that's what I'm trying to do in my blogs. Like, hey guys, I want you to see something that you may not be aware of here, but the beast is all around us. The second answer is, there is, in Rome, it was explicit, right? And although false teachers were telling people that they can compromise it and get away with it, in Rome it was explicit by saying, you can do these things and not compromise your faith, and like going to a pagan temple and et cetera, et cetera. And so in our society, I think the harlot Babylon is more of an issue for Americans. The harlot Babylon is more of an issue than it is the beast. I think our brothers and sisters in India that are on the call have more of a problem with the beast, because the Hindu culture, which is a nationalistic culture, and the emperor, the prime minister is Hindu, and so there's a great pressure for them to compromise with Hindu beliefs. That's the beast, right? Or the false prophet and the beast. The harlot Babylon, which we'll get to in Revelation 17 and 18, is commercialism, commodities, things, pleasure, wealth, prosperity. And I think the Western church has fallen prey to her way more than to the beast. So the first thing that happens with it, Anthony, is to be aware of it. I don't think we're ever going to alleviate our concerns. I think that's the point, actually, is to live in this tension. Being aware of that tension, sometimes we might go too far and we're like, oh, wow, I went too far. My point in my blogs and even in this study here is to say, guys, wake up, wake up, wake up. Just be aware that there's a problem here. Because I think most American Christians have given into the beast and given into the harlot and aren't even aware of it. So, but I agree. I have a nice home. I have a lot of comforts of living in America. And my heart breaks 5 times a week when I'm on these calls with our brothers and sisters in India. And it's like, I don't, it is a struggle, and I don't know that there's an answer, but I think the first answer is being aware of the tension and then discerning every moment from that day forward when it is, hey, that's the beast. Christian nationalism is the church being wed with the beast, right? So if you're in America, which I don't, Christian nationalism is a misnomer because it's not Christian, right? It just most of the people who hold to Christian nationalism are not Christians. They just believe that the United States is only supposed to be a Christian nation for white supremacist racist people. but Christians that go along with that and say, yeah, that's what God says. That's going into bed with the beast. So, all right. And I'll go further in my blog over the next 6 months, but as you can see, I'm leading up. Does that help a little bit? Not as much as you wanted, I don't think, but
Yeah, there's never a finite answer. It's just the wrestling with it on an individual basis.
Yep.
I mean, we try and really be a
Yep.
blessing to a lot of different people.
Yep.
But there's always that tension. And am I living beyond my means? Which I don't think we are, but that's what this country almost fosters and wants you to do. So,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep. Exactly. Absolutely. Yep. There's and if anyone comes up and says, well, here's the answer, here's where we draw the line, you are being legalistic, and that might be the answer for you and for your family, but I don't know that we can impose that upon somebody else and say what that line is. I think, yeah, there's a lot to be said here. We'll go further more as we go along. So, all right, somebody else? No. All right. Let me note one more thing here before we finish up, and that's this. Note chapter 7. Note there's a chapter break, and you're like, well, wait a minute. There shouldn't be a chapter break. We've got one more seal left. There's 7 seals. He's only broken 6 of them, and there's a chapter break. And if you look at chapter 7, verse 1, it's not the 7th seal. You're not going to find the 7th seal until you get to chapter 8, verse 1, when the Lamb broke the 7th seal. Oh, so chapter 7 is what we're going to call an interlude. It's a pause. John stopping the narrative. He's not describing the 7 seals any longer. He's got 6 of them done, and he's going to pause. And he's going to describe, well, we'll discuss it next week, 144,000 and the great multitude. And it's very significant. But the first thing to notice is where this occurs in the story after the 6th seal, before the 7th seal, and it's a pause. It's not part of the 6th seal. It's a pause. All right. And the word for that would be an interlude. Okay. All right. So we'll pick it up there next week with that. So if we have any more questions, I'm going to go ahead. If any questions or comments here, I'll stop the Facebook Live feed. Again, if you're on Facebook Live or you're on my YouTube channel, you can join the live Zoom study, which is being recorded at 6:00 p.m. Pacific time on Wednesday nights. And by sending me a note, either on Facebook Messenger, use the determinetruth.com website and the contact me page, or if you have my email address, rdalrymple19@gmail.com, and send me your email address, and then I can include you in the Facebook feed. So, I'm sorry, in the Zoom link. All right. So any other questions or comments before I stop the recordings?
Anthony made me think about something that I wondered about, and that is our move to Hawaii. It was something that I prayed over for many years, and Hawaii was not a place I thought of moving to at all. I just wanted to be near warm water and away from the pollen that was
Right.
taking havoc on my health. But it felt to me as I asked and as we did each thing that it was God's plan for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, how can something so wonderful be a plan for him to do? And why would he do that for me? And if we're supposed to be careful and not worship this other stuff, then how does that fit in there?
Well, you can certainly do it in Hawaii. To say that you couldn't do it in Hawaii would be to say that you can't be a Christian and live in Hawaii. And like, well, no, obviously you can, right? But what the question is we have to discern, right? Which is part of the process I think you said you just went through, is at what point have I gone beyond my needs? And at what point do I take whatever other resources that I now have and use them for kingdom purposes? Right. And that's a hard one.
Which is always the same struggle as it has been, because I believe in that doesn't.
You believe in what? I
believe to do that, but Doug doesn't.
Yeah. Well, yeah, sure. And that and there's nothing you can do there. I mean, you can do the best, well, nothing you can do, but you can do the best that you can do, right? And that's all you can do. That's right.
Okay.
So, yep. So we're going to have a podcast in a couple of weeks that'll air in a few weeks when we'll talk about this more specifically. But the point that I'm going to make on that is in 1 Corinthians 11 and 12, you have the reality that the church is one body. And so when we realize that we're one body, we realize it says, and Paul says this explicitly, if one member suffers, the whole body suffers. And I think too often we look within our local community and go, oh, well, where everyone's fine. Okay, I'm good. I'm good to spend my surplus. And the reality is, no, we have brothers and sisters on this call and around the world who have needs, whether it's a
That's
need
very much
for
so here,
justice
too.
in North Korea, whether it's a need for justice in a militant Islamic country, or whether it's a need for justice because they've been sold into sex trafficking or sex slavery, or whether it's a need for clothes for school or tuition so they can go to school, or whether it's a need for legal representation because they've been wrongly incarcerated. I mean, there's just, the reality is that there's the needs within the body of Christ, and I think we need to be more aware of those too. But again, it's hard. I think this is a struggle that the American church needs to wrestle with, because, and I don't think that we do a good enough job with it. Although obviously, I think most of you guys have heard me teaching on this for a long time, and we've all been in this journey for a while together. So, okay, all right.
Rob, can I ask
Please.
a quick clarifying question? Earlier on, you made a distinction between something from vengeance, where vengeance is where you take justice into your own hands, and what was the other? What was it? It wasn't justice, was it?
It was a cry for justice. Yeah, vengeance or justice, and they were crying out to God for justice, for God to do what is just, and not for God to give vengeance on their enemy. It comes across as a cry for vengeance because that's ultimately, hey, look, but really what they're crying for is justice. If it was vengeance, they would take it in their own hands.
So how does that tie up with what you just said about us responding to the need for justice in the world? Because that's doing stuff, that's us acting, right? So
That's right. But we can't act in a vengeful way, would be the way to say it, right?
okay.
Yeah. So love doesn't only submit to, so an important distinction that we need to make as we proceed is that love doesn't only simply die for the sake of your enemies. Love also says, I love my enemies so much, you need to stop doing that. Or I love this person over there so much, you need to stop doing that to them. I mean, that's also what it means to love your neighbors, right? And to say, stop doing this, and hey, by the way, these people are being oppressed. You need to stop doing this. Or to go to governments and saying, like if you read my article, on the last couple of weeks on my blog, it's like the corruption in FIFA, which is obviously, kind of gone in bed with Qatar and said, hey, guess what? We're just going to turn a blind eye to all your humanitarian issues. And give you a World Cup, and yet 6,000 or more people died building World Cup stadiums and hotels and infrastructure. And Qatar had a system, I think it's called the kafala system, which they outlawed like a couple of years ago, but like 8 years after they got the World Cup bid. And the kafala system basically was, if you're a migrant and you come here to work, we take your passport, and the only way you can leave is if you get permission from your boss because he has your passport. You can't switch jobs. You can't leave the country. You're a slave. I mean, it's modern day slavery. Yeah. And then these employees weren't even getting paid. They were living in abject poverty and squalor. They had no showers. They were washing their hair in the toilets and brushing their teeth. And they had 8 people in a small room. I mean, this is what Qatar was doing, and yet FIFA said, "Oh, this is the greatest thing because we're bringing the World Cup to the Middle East." Well, great, bring it to the Middle East, but this country has human rights issues, and we need to say that's not acceptable, right? And I think that's also what love looks like. But again, that's justice, not vengeance.
Okay.
Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
All right. You're welcome. I hope that was clear. All right, I'm gonna stop the recordings.